He received his PhD in history from CUNY Graduate Center and specializes in New York City history. Since 2017, he's co-curated 6 LGBTQ exhibits at LaGuardia, including a seat at the table on LGBTQ elected officials in the New York City Council and state legislature. Prior to his work at LaGuardia, he held the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship at the New York Historical Society and at the Museum of the City of New York, where in 2015 he curated the exhibition Folk City, New York, and the Folk Music Revival, and co-authored the accompanying book, published by Oxford University Press. His next public history project at LaGuardia will examine the AIDS policy in New York City from 1981 to 1996. And after he does a little presentation on the Intro to exhibition, he will be in conversation with Village Preservation's very own executive director, Andrew Berman, and he's which I've mentioned all the things that Village Preservation does. But in the time he's led us, he's led the organization to successful efforts to secure the landmark designation of those 1,250 buildings, including groundbreaking designations honoring LGBTQ+, African American, immigrant, and artistic countercultural history. He's an architectural historian and also has worked extensively in the fields of tenant and housing advocacy, as well as cultural preservation, particularly for underrepresented groups. Gentlemen, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Will, and I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure. Greenwich Village, my stomping ground in New York City. I've spent so much of my time researching the neighborhood's history, as you all know, incredibly rich. And as William mentioned, at LaGuardia and Wagner Archives, I'm a historian, and we are a New York City archives. We have the collections of the papers of the mayors, from Fiorello LaGuardia to Rudolph Giuliani. We have the New York City Housing Authority collection for those of you interested in public history. We have the New York City Council collection on local government, really treasure troves. And since 2016, I've been working on LGBTQ exhibits at LaGuardia and Wagner Archives. We're supported by New York City Council. And about 2 years ago, I was doing research. What could be my next exhibit, my next online exhibit? I work with faculty, students, staff there. And I was researching our City Council collection, and I found thousands of pages of documents in the correspondence of former City Council members, Ruth Messenger, Carol Bellamy, Miriam Friedlander, several others, Tom Cute, and on the gay rights bill. Mostly a forgotten subject, and I've spoken to several people, even tonight. People know a little bit about it, but not too much. And I decided, wow, this is a great opportunity for me and our students at LaGuardia to do an examination of this mostly forgotten struggle for civil rights in New York City for New York's gay and lesbian community. We recruited students to do research in the archives, in the City Council collection. We also ended up doing oral history interviews with 25 individuals, former City Council members, prominent gay and lesbian activists, and journalists, and compiled this exhibit on our website at LaGuardia and Wagner Archives, which I'll be referring to frequently throughout this presentation. The first thing I want to define exactly what was the New York City Gay Rights Bill. Well, first of all, New York City was the first city in the nation to propose a gay rights bill. In January 1971, of course, in the wake of Stonewall, there was a surge of activism, as we know, formation of groups, a radical group like the Gay Liberation Front, the GLF, established just after Stonewall, had a radical agenda, not just for gay and lesbian rights, but really to overhaul American society, demolish the patriarchy, formed an alliance with the Black Panther movement, critical of American foreign policy, opponents of the war in Vietnam. short-lived group, the GLF, but dissident members of the GLF ended up forming the Gay Activists Alliance, the GAA, at the very end of 1969, and a critical organization in the narrative of the Gay Rights Bill. Now, the Gay Rights Bill itself, as I said, let's define it. Basically, it was meant to prohibit discrimination in the areas of housing, employment, and public accommodations on the basis of sexual orientation. And there was an existing human rights law in New York City that went back to 1955, NDA Non-Discrimination Act, which had already prohibited discrimination in these areas on the basis of race, color, creed, gender. And in short, the Gay Rights Bill just wanted to add 2 words to this existing bill: sexual orientation. And the bill first proposed in City Council in January 1971, co-sponsored by Eldon Klingon, who is mostly forgotten, still alive. We conducted an oral history interview with him, and Carter Burden, who represented the Upper East Side in City Council, as well as Ted Weiss and Leonard Skolnick were also supporters of it. And at first glance, the bill might seem, well, pretty modest, right? Non-Discrimination Act, prohibit discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. What do I mean by public accommodations? Service at restaurants, at hotels, at bars. But the initial sponsor of it, Eldon Klingon, imagined it to be much more than that. This would be the basis of a social revolution. The first thing was to get the Non-Discrimination Act passed, and then subsequently there would be an ongoing struggle for rights in other realms. Education, service in the military, same-sex marriage legislation. But this is the initial step forward. And I want to play a clip from this interview with former Councilmember Eldon Klingon, basically giving his take on the Gay Rights Bill and what it meant.
We got this idea that the phrase we would use is sexual orientation, and this took a good deal of time to work out what we were going to do. That basically meant that gays and lesbians would have protection in the areas of housing and employment. Now, it didn't seem to me at the time that was a great deal, but I never thought of this bill as being simply what it said. I always saw this bill as being a focal point for agitation.
Klingon, by the way, was socialist in background, originally from the Midwest, came to New York, attended Hunter College and Columbia University before he was elected to City Council in 1969 when John Lindsay was re-elected mayor. As I mentioned, the Gay Activists Alliance very much worked with City Council. So in contrast to the GLF, a radical organization working outside the parameters of political parties, the GAA indeed worked closely with City Council people like Jim Owls, Alan Roscoff, Morty Robinson, and others. And the GAA really emerged as the prominent supporters, activist organization from around 1970 to 1974. In fact, their headquarters was located nearby in Soho on 99 Wooster Street, in an old firehouse, which was converted to their headquarters. So they said, well, let's just call it Firehouse. And yeah, it was this almost legendary meeting place, place for people to gather. And the GAA was really significant for, I would argue, for a couple of reasons. One, their methods of protest. called ZAPs. Familiar with ZAPs? I see a few of you nodding your heads. ZAPs were these loud, rowdy, boisterous protests meant to draw attention to homophobia in New York City politics, in the media, elsewhere. Just let me give you one example of a ZAP to illustrate the point. The 1972 Inner Circle dinner. Are you familiar with the Inner Circle? This gathering of journalists every year at a major space venue in Midtown. It's a black tie affair, very formal. It's a charitable evening. It's a bit satirical. There's skits, there's sketches. The governor usually attends, the mayor typically attends. And in 1972, somehow a few members of the Gay Activist Alliance got tickets to the 1972 Inner Circle dinner, and very upset at the media coverage of the emerging gay rights movement. Felt that the media trafficked in stereotypes, coverage was superficial, disparaging, pejorative. So in the middle of the Inner Circle dinner, someone's up on stage, a member of the Gay Activist Alliance gets up on stage, Alan Roscoff, young Alan Roscoff, and just says, "This dinner is over. We will no longer tolerate pejorative coverage of the gay rights," and people yelling, in the seats, different tables, and a melee breaks out, a fight breaks out. The head of the Firemen's Union, Michael May, pummels Jim Owls of the Gay Activist Alliance, Alan Roscoff, and of course it got a good deal of coverage the next day in the newspapers because it's immediate. And so this was like one way, a ZAP, to draw attention. There would be no more polite protests, but there would be these confrontations, nonviolent but confrontational. So the GA is very much known for ZAPs, working with City Council closely to advocate for the bill. And the second thing was Saturday night dances. Familiar with these at the Firehouse on 99 Worcester Street? So you would have hundreds, even about 1,000 people attending these Saturday night dances. Disco is the emerging soundtrack of the gay rights movement in the early 70s, and it was a tremendous occasion to build a social network, to bond, to meet like-minded individuals. It was such a liberating affair. So the GAA is for civil rights, but it's also for sexual and cultural liberation. And this meeting site, indeed provided a space, a place to find community. And during our interviews with many former GAA individuals, we heard this over and over again. I'm going to play a clip now from Daniel Trum, who was only 17, 18 years old at the time in the early 1970s. He would become a 3-term city council member from Queens, Jackson Heights, and parts of Elmhurst under the Queens Pride Parade in 1993, talking about just what the Firehouse meant, these Saturday night dances.
We had found out that the Gay Activist Alliance was having meetings on Worcester Street, but we didn't know what to expect. We were kids from Long Island, and I had a license, so I went to pick up my friend who lived in Franklin Square, actually, and we got to the Firehouse about 9 p.m. at night. Of course, things don't really start until about 11 p.m. But we got to meet people as we walked in the door. The minute I walked in the door at the Firehouse, I knew I had found a home. See, when I grew up as a gay kid, I thought I was the only one in the world. And meeting hundreds and maybe thousands of people at the Firehouse was just the most incredible experience of my life. I think it's what really fueled my activism in the end, was that, being there, knowing that there were thousands of people like me, finally gave me the freedom to be able to express myself openly.
the importance of these spaces like the firehouse. Now, back to the bill in City Council again, it's introduced by Klingon and Berman in 1971. Well, what happens to it? Now, you need to know a little bit about the process of passing legislation in City Council. The bill first goes to a committee, and it needs to be approved in a smaller committee before it gets a full floor vote in City Council. In this case, the gay rights bill went to the General Welfare Committee. Seemingly an odd choice. There's still a General Welfare Committee today. It deals with homeless services, human resources. There was no Civil Rights Committee back then, which you might have expected at the time in the early 70s. But anyway, it's in the General Welfare Committee. Now, the head of the City Council, the majority leader, they didn't have a speaker at the time, the majority leader was Tom Cute, a prominent figure, the majority leader from 1969 to 1985. He was based in Brooklyn, Park Slope, represented parts of Park Slope, Windsor Terrace, Red Hook, Sunset Park, vehemently anti-gay. Born in 1913, came of age in the 30s during LaGuardia's New Deal, a modern liberal in this respect, served in World War II, shaped by the encyclicals of the Catholic Church in the 1950s, just had no interest at all in gay rights. In fact, he was a close advisor to Cardinals Spellman, Cook, and O'Connor. So much for the separation of church and politics, right? Tom Cute, last name spelled C-U-I-T-E. Basically, he appointed individuals to each committee. So he stocked the General Welfare Committee with anti-gay city council members, people like Aileen Ryan from the Bronx. And mind you, most of these folks were liberal on issues like on labor, on employment, on housing, but that liberalism did not extend to gay rights in the 1970s. So that's interesting to think about what liberalism meant in this context in New York City, the quintessential liberal city, right, in the US in the 1970s. So Cute, and not a household name, but very powerful, basically bottled up the gay rights bill in the General Welfare Committee. It seldom got a full floor vote. It did once in 1974. It got out of general welfare and it was voted down 22 to 19. Let me just play a clip from one of Cute's colleagues, Sal Albanese, who's a city council member based in Brooklyn, Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, one of the most culturally conservative neighborhoods in all of New York City, a high concentration of Catholic churches, who ended up voting for the gay rights bill in 1986. But he reflects about Tom Cute.
Oh, he was totally opposed, totally. He wouldn't even let it come to the floor. In 86 is when Valone allowed it to come to the floor, although he opposed it. Cute bottled it up. And Tom was, he was a very shrewd politician, very close to the Catholic Church. He was a traditional Irish Catholic palm, and very close to the county organization. But this one issue, there was no way that he was going to allow a vote on this issue. And he had a lot of allies in the city council. Aileen Ryan from the Bronx. She chaired, I think, the General Welfare Committee. She was very hostile towards this, towards gay rights. So, yeah, Tom, very shrewd, excellent politician, and was totally opposed to the gay rights bill. Hostile towards it, I would say.
He mentions religion, and we can't underestimate the power of religion in New York City politics in the 1970s and 80s. The Catholic Church in particular, the Catholic Church's hierarchy, absolutely opposed to the gay rights bill. What were some of the reasons? Well, we have many documents, hundreds of pages of documents from the Catholic Church written to Tom Cute in our City Council collection at LaGuardia and Wagner Archives. And the gist of it was, well, we're opposed to it for moral reasons, and the term used then, terminology was homosexuality is a menace to family life, it's immoral, and if the bill passes in a legal institution that legitimates it. Existing laws protect gay and lesbian New Yorkers, so that a new law is not even necessary. Making many of these arguments and firmly opposed to it. Interestingly, religion is a theme in this exhibit, and I very much encourage you again to visit our website to probe this. Religion is one of the themes. We interviewed Father Bernard Lynch, a gay Catholic priest, who estimated about 50% of Catholic priests were gay in New York in the 1970s. So the hierarchy is possibly different than priests at the local level, but you had to fall in line at the local level in your local parish. But so very much opposed to it. Now, Cute also was receiving, as I mentioned, thousands of letters advocating for the gay rights bill, people opposed to it as well. And part of this exhibit does, in fact, include archival resources from the City Council collection, in addition to the oral history excerpts which you've been seeing. And I just want to show you, as my students and I were doing research, one particularly poignant letter that I found. Poignant, and I'll read it if you can't see it in the back. Partly because it's handwritten. I just thought, wow, somebody taking the time out of their busy schedule, New Yorkers, how busy are we, to write a letter to Councilman Q, October 1977. Dear Councilman Q, I'm writing to you in regard to Intro 554, that was the gay rights bill at the time. Because I'm a lesbian, because I often must hide in fear, especially losing my job, I urge you to stop your work against the gay and lesbian rights bill. Why should I, solely on the basis of my sexual preference, be discriminated against? I am much more than my sexuality. I play piano. I ride a bike. I enjoy hiking. I read books, etc. Never have I even considered molesting a child, forcing someone into an act that they didn't want to perform. What I do in private is my business, and what right do you, or does anyone else, have to say that I am sick, or criminal, or bad? What right has my employer to fire me, even though I do an excellent job, just because I am homosexual? Please don't make life much more difficult for me and others like me. Please support Intro 554. Sincerely, Maryland. Because there is yet no law to protect me against discrimination, I am afraid to sign my name. I live in your district. And this is interesting in its own right. It really brought me to tears, frankly, when I first read it, how poignant it was, just breaking it down. I hike, I play piano, and the fact that you couldn't sign your last name. There were fundraisers held in the 70s, and by different various gay and lesbian organizations, people seldom wrote checks. Why? Your name's on the check. You give cash because you did not want a paper trail. You did not want to be identified at some point that you supported the movement. So this is the fear, and the Catholic Church isn't recognizing this. Councilmember Cute isn't recognizing this. The mayor at the time in the late 70s was, of course, Ed Koch. And he emerges as the most contested figure in this exhibit, Ed Koch. Three-term mayor, elected in 1977, a highly contentious Democratic mayoral primary involving Bella Abzug, Mario Cuomo, Percy Sutton, Herman Badillo. Koch emerges as the victor. He prior to this, he was in Congress, right? He served in Congress from 1968 to 1976, representing this neighborhood and others in Manhattan. In fact, he had a stronger record on gay rights in Congress than he did as mayor. Why is that? Well, because he just represented a Manhattan district mostly on the west side, versus being mayor of 5 boroughs of New York City. And his base, in part, was parts of Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, parts of the Bronx, culturally conservative areas. Remember the 1970s, this was Archie Bunker time period in Queens, the fictional bigot in Queens. So he's very much cognizant of his base in the outer boroughs. He does support the gay rights bill, but not to the extent that activists like Andy Hum and Alan Roscoff wanted. What happened to Koch? He said, I support the gay rights bill, but if you in city council oppose it out of religious conviction, I understand I won't pressure you. And then all of a sudden, so many city council members find Jesus. And all of a sudden they become religious and they vote against it, they say out of religious conviction. So Koch, a closeted gay mayor. You read that piece in the New York Times a couple of years ago, I think it was 2022. The Sunday New York Times, of course, a wisecracking, affable mayor, how am I doing? Suited for the fiscal crisis, the wake of the fiscal crisis to restore the city's finances, but it seems like he lived a rather tortured life in the closet. That's the sense that I got from that particular article. And for many interviews, activists like Hum and Roscoff won't forgive Koch posthumously because he didn't come out. Had he come out, he could have used his leverage. Not to say he would have been a confrontational activist, but he could have applied pressure. He was a popular mayor, especially in the second term, could have used leverage to advance the gay rights bill, but tread lightly, and of course, also on AIDS, criticized by individuals like Larry Kramer from ACT UP, as we know. Now, this led to many debates. We have many supporters in this exhibit of Koch, defenders, people like John Lindsay, Chris Lynn, again, many opponents. I do want to play a clip from Chris Lynn, who was counsel to the Coalition of Lesbian and Gay Rights, which emerged in 1977 in response to the Anita Bryant anti-gay campaign in Florida. Chris was counsel. He would work in the Koch administration and the Giuliani administration about Koch coming out. Or not coming out.
He was my mother's age. Speak to somebody born in 1923. He went to World War II. He was a sergeant in the Army. He served the country. Different time, different paradigm, different kind of oppression. We used to say at GLID or GID, don't ever criticize another gay person until you've walked in their shoes. Don't out other people. Don't do it. That was our motto, our credo. Don't hurt other people. Help them. They need a job or a apartment. Help people. We did that a lot.
Yes, a highly contested figure, Ed Koch. And this exhibit, again, I invite you to view some of these clips, and you'll find a whole clips across the political spectrum. Now, the real turning point was 1985 in this narrative. Tom Cute retired in Brooklyn. There were elections. Mayor Koch was reelected to a third term. We have a new city council, a younger city council, more progressive. Now we're going to have a speaker of city council. And Koch wanted Peter Vallone from Astoria, Queens. A devout Catholic, went to church every day, went to Mass every day, opposed the gay rights bill. Koch held him in high regard and said, look, Peter, I will support your attempts to gain the speaker position if you agree to let the gay rights bill out of the General Welfare Committee, appoint people sympathetic to it, give it a full floor vote, let it have a full floor vote, and tell people, council members, to vote their conscience. So Vallone ended up being elected speaker thanks to Koch's support, appoints members to the General Welfare Committee, it gets voted out of committee, and we've got a full floor vote in April 1986, and it passed. Finally, it passed. 15 years after it was first introduced, by a vote of 21 to 14. 14 members were still opposed to it as late as 1986, interestingly. New York City, the first city in the nation to propose a gay rights bill, the 51st city to pass one. Many cities, college towns passed them relatively quickly. Ann Arbor, Berkeley, East Lansing, smaller cities, New York City, the 51st city. And I think this is a good place to conclude, and I think, Andrew, you have some comments, questions, and then we can open it up to the audience for Q&A.
Well, that was fascinating. Thank you. And I also just highly recommend everybody explore the exhibit, the archive. I mean, it's just a treasure trove. We can really only sort of skim the surface of it here tonight, but it's really wonderful that this exists, because it's such an important story, one that I think a lot of it over time has gotten sort of lost, hazy, forgotten, and a lot of these details, when you look at them again from the lens of 2024, are just incredibly powerful and striking. A couple of questions. So you hit on this at the beginning, but tell us a little bit about what the sort of genesis was for you and for others in terms of, I want to put this archive together that, sort of really fully tells this story. And were there things that you wanted to make sure were in there that you felt weren't really out there but needed to be?
Yes. First of all, historians have largely overlooked this. To my surprise, you would think New York City, a focal point of gay and lesbian politics and culture, of queer culture, the home of Stonewall, ACT UP, the Pride Parade, and yet almost nothing on the gay rights bill. This was the civil rights movement for gay and lesbian New Yorkers. And I was astonished that so little had been done. And it's always been my goal at LaGuardia to probe topics off the beaten path, relatively unexplored. We did an exhibit on the Queen's Pride Parade, based largely on Danny Drum's archive. He donated his papers in 2016 at the Queen's Museum. The Children of the Rainbow Curriculum controversy of 1992, do you remember that? The City Board of Education suggested to first grade teachers, when they taught about the family, to acknowledge same-sex headed households, and it created a firestorm, especially in District 24 in Queens. So, Andrew, it's always been my objective to explore topics that have largely been overlooked. And I wanted to get some of the key figures in this narrative. Tom Cute, very few people heard of him. One of the most powerful individuals in New York City politics. And I felt that we needed to probe his time as majority leader. We needed to look at activist organizations. Many people know about the GAA, because when I saw people nodding their head, the Gay Activist Alliance, very prominent. Not as many knew about the Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Rights, again emerging in 1977 in response to Anita Bryant's anti-gay campaign in Miami-Dade County, where the gay rights bill was repealed thanks to Bryant's anti-gay activism. So that really helped New Yorkers mobilize. We need to do something. So the CLGR, the Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Rights, I wanted to acknowledge. I wanted to integrate race into this narrative as well. Frankly, the leaders of the gay and lesbian rights movement, for the most part, were white cisgender men based in Lower Manhattan, but I knew there was more to it than that. And I was able to conduct oral histories with members of the organization Black and White Men Together, founded in 1980, became Men of All Colors Together. So there's a unit, a theme on race in the exhibit, and religion. Again, as I mentioned, you can't exaggerate the importance of religion in politics in New York City. Still the case today, would you say? Not as much in the 70s and 80s when you had people like O'Connor, right? O'Connor and Koch were friends. They even put a musical on Broadway, and I think they co-wrote a book. So these were some of the sub-themes that I wanted to analyze. We found people to do oral history interviews, 25 in total, which we could have done about 40, but it's hard to pin down people. And to explore this, and it was a great opportunity for myself and students and faculty and staff at LaGuardia.
I would imagine for the students especially, it must have been eye-opening to read some of these things. I'm old enough that some of this I can remember, some of it predates me, but when I see a movie from the 1950s like Imitation of Life, it just, it pulls at my heart in a way, because I can't imagine living in a world where race plays the role that it did then, because I'm fortunate enough to have lived in a world that was better than that, not perfect. And so I can imagine that for these students to sort of realize the pressure, the stigma, the discrimination, I'm sure is striking. Of course, we're particularly interested in exploring the ways in which this all intersects with this part of town. And as you've talked about this, you mentioned so many people in so many places who were connected to the village in Lower Manhattan. One thing that I was curious to ask you about is, so this was the first gay rights bill introduced in a city, but it had a federal counterpart, which was introduced by Ed Koch and Bella Abzug in Congress. And I'm wondering if in terms of your exploration of this, two things. One is how much the sort of interaction between the federal version of this and the city version of this might have kind of come up. Were people at the same time lobbying at City Hall as they were to try to get it moving in DC? And I've read interesting things. Of course, Abzug and Koch were rivals, although obviously their territory, both in terms of politics and geography, overlapped, but there were some significant differences there. And I'm just curious how much you came across some of that tension.
Yes. We really see at the national level, more towards the later 1970s, gay activists mobilizing following the Anita Bryant anti-gay campaign, because they thought there would be a movement in the late 70s with the rise of conservatism that would lead to the election of Reagan in '80, that more gay rights bills would be repealed. And there's and also the assassination of Harvey Milk in San Francisco had a galvanizing effect on activists, and that leads to the first national march on Washington in 1979. And this was a pivotal moment. We talked a lot about this more towards the late 70s, but you're right. Koch in Congress, Bella in Congress were absolute champions of gay rights. And it's funny, we interviewed Alan Roscoff of the Gay Activists Alliance, now he's president of the Jim Ellis Club. He said, you know what we would do? We would call up Koch's office and say, Bella's going to appear at our next meeting, and then we'd call up Bella's office and say, Koch is going to appear, and so they both would come, just to be there, thinking that they're rivals, they both wanted to be present. So
I think Alan still does that.
Yeah, I believe so. So yeah, indeed, they were strong voices in Congress, and there was overlap. There was also, as you say, a rivalry. There's a new documentary that just came out on Bella, maybe a year ago or so. But it really was the emphasis in the 70s to pass this bill at the local level first. Let's get it passed in cities, in college towns, large cities and small cities alike. And then slowly, activists are organizing at the national level more towards the later 1970s.
One of the things that this also highlights for me, so I grew up in the outer boroughs in the Northeast Bronx. I had parents who, thought Ed Koch was perfect. they were definitely Ed Koch Democrats, and I'm certainly familiar with that sort of more culturally conservative outer borough scene, so certainly from that era. And it's interesting because I feel like this sort of like highlights what were in some ways the sort of the two New Yorks of the time. You know, there was this emerging, very what we would call progressive, largely but not exclusively Manhattan-based political scene, and then in the outer boroughs there's this very strong, deeply entrenched, much more culturally conservative political scene, and they were all very invested in the same city, but from a different perspective. I think one of your interviews is with Fernando Ferrer, correct? Who was in the city council, who was, like Sal Albanese, another one of these outer borough city council members who did support the gay rights bill. I'm just sort of curious what insights you found in terms of these tensions between these two New Yorks that were made so apparent by this.
Yeah, the exhibit really challenges the conventional wisdom that New York City was just overwhelmingly a queer-friendly city. And thank you for citing Albanese and Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, Ferrer in parts of the central South Bronx. They were receiving hate mail, hundreds of letters, even death threats for their support of the gay rights bill. Of course, I said to them, "Do you still have the letters? We'd love to have these in the archive." They said, no, we threw these letters away. But they felt immense pressure when they announced that they would support the gay rights bill. So there's a theme in the exhibit, Gay New York, Homophobic New York, where I identify clips, people saying, oh yeah, of course there was Greenwich Village and Park Slope and Brooklyn Heights and parts of Jackson Heights, queer-friendly, openly visible areas, but there was also Bayside, Queens, and most of Staten, not all of Staten Island. And so, like the tapestry of New York, the geography of New York, the anti-queer diversity of New York, most African Americans and Puerto Ricans in the Bronx opposed to it, most white ethnics of outer boroughs in Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island opposed to it. And it's an interesting anti-gay coalition, if you will. And these city council members voting against it feared they would not, they feared for their political lives. If I support it, I risk losing re-election. And that was the mindset of many.
Delving into that a little bit further, so, it's relatively easy to figure out why politicians from this part of town would be supportive of it. It was actually probably politically advantageous or necessary, and I'm sure a lot of them genuinely felt strongly about these issues. Some may have been a little less sort of genuine. Did you have a sense for those who came from these areas where it wasn't politically expedient, what motivated them to, suffer these slings and arrows and still stand up for the gay rights bill?
Yeah, sure. Freddie Ferrer just said, look, I'm Puerto Rican in the Bronx. I faced discrimination growing up. I knew what it meant to be discriminated against, my parents. So I did it because it was the right thing. Albanese the same. He was born in Italy, came to Brooklyn, I think when he was 8 or 9 years old, working class, Italian background, parents struggled, blue collar, manufacturing, same thing. We could relate, we could empathize. By no means were they champions of gay rights, these two, but I think they boiled it down. This is the right thing. This is a civil rights issue. You could be Catholic and you can debate theology, but this is apart from that. I once spoke to Reverend Al Sharpton about this. I worked with him on his museum, civil rights. But anyway, we talked about it, and he said he had a conversation with Cardinal O'Connor, and Cardinal O'Connor said to him, you support gay rights? And he said, yeah, Cardinal, we could debate the theology, but this is a civil rights measure, and that's how many of them saw it in city council. And you're right, many of them genuinely supported it. Ruth Messenger, we interviewed based in the Upper West Side, was a longtime champion of it. She has a daughter who's a lesbian. That I wouldn't attribute that necessarily, but she was a longtime supporter of it, Ruth Messenger. It wasn't politically risky. Interestingly, Carol Greitzer, who was Koch's partner going back to the Village Independent Democrats in the 50s and 60s, co-district leaders, elected to city council, served from 68 to 1990, initially reluctant, perhaps even opposed, and Eldon Klingen, go visit his interview in this exhibit. When Eldon said to Carol, look, I'm going to meet up with the Gay Activists Alliance, we're working on this bill, she said, why would you do that? So initially she was reluctant, and in fact, she was challenged by Jim Owls of the Gay Activists Alliance in 1973. Of course, the GAA knew that Owls would lose. He only won 17%, but it was an incremental step to build a political infrastructure, to mobilize, to lobby, to get people involved, to come out above all. She defeated David Rothenberg in 1985, an openly gay candidate. That was a close election. She defeated Tom Duane, you worked with Tom, in '89. But Tom ultimately won in 1990. There was redistricting. He defeated Liz Azza, who was openly lesbian. How about that? An openly gay man running against an open lesbian. Only in New York City do we have this, in 1990.
And could do a whole program about that one. Of course, in addition to Stonewall, you mentioned how the formation of the GLF, and then its evolution into the GAA, the Firehouse, all of these places, downtown that were such a nexus of organizing and of evolution of thought. I'm curious, as time went on from the early 70s through 1986, if there were other organizations, other places, other locations that you saw coming up a lot as places where this, sort of activism was coming out of or being inspired by.
Absolutely. The 1970s was a period of organizing, a period of coalition building. You have Dignity for Gay Catholics. You have CBST, the Gay Synagogue, established in 1973. You got Salsa Soul Sisters, established in 1974. And
all located down here.
Oh,
for the most part.
Yeah, that's right. Now you say that, I make that connection. It was the Washington Methodist Church.
Yeah.
P-Flag was founded in 1973 by Jean Manford, right around the corner, mother of Morty Manford, a member of the GAA. Men of All Colors Together, established in San Francisco, Black and White Men Together, initially called 1980 in San Francisco, and the New York chapter was founded in 1980. And by the way, important organization because they protested discriminatory policies within the gay movement. Gay bars denying admission to African American men. And they protested. One famous one was the Ice Palace on West 57th Street, close to Carnegie Hall. So yeah, there was a tremendous amount of organizational work done at the grassroots level, much of it indeed happening in Lower Manhattan in this very area. And it's a fascinating period for those interested in the study of coalition building.
You of course mentioned Tom, who I worked for 9 years. I haven't had a chance to listen to his interview yet. Can you tell us a little bit about what he talked about and what insights he offered? Because so for him, his political life clearly would not have been possible without kind of all of these developments that preceded him. And I know that as a young man, it's funny, I would not have known who Tom Hughes was, except I heard all the stories from Tom Duane. and about the deal to get Peter Valone the speakership and what it was contingent upon. And even though Peter was adamantly anti the gay rights bill, he nevertheless was going to let a vote go through. So I'm just kind of curious what came out of that.
Yeah, the Tom Duane interview. We also have the Tom Duane collection at LaGuardia and Wagner Archives. Tom was from Queens, and he knew that he had no political career in Queens as an openly gay man. Moved to Chelsea after he went to school at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania in the mid to late 70s. Helped establish the Chelsea, was the Chelsea Gay Club, I think, a local club in Chelsea, and was elected to district leader in 1982, served as district leader in Chelsea for 8 years. Really a tremendous activist at the community level. Tom, to your point earlier, Andrew, spoke about anti-gay violence at the Fulton houses in Chelsea. So gay men walking to the meatpacking district and the piers on the west side, a popular cruising area circa the late 70s, early 80s, often went by the Fulton houses, and there was often violence against them. And Tom was an instrumental figure in going to Fulton houses. He speaks about this rather eloquently in meeting with a leader at Fulton houses who would end up pressuring residents of the houses to end this. And apparently this individual had such power that, she used her leverage. So Tom talked about that, and Tom talked about his work as district leader and ultimately his election to city council in this highly contested race against Liz Abzug in 1990. Began service in 1991, would be in city council for 7 years before he went to state senate. And I think you worked with him in Albany, is that right?
That's great. I'm curious if from any of the people that you interviewed, if any of them sort of talked about this era and their role in it from the different perspective of decades of evolution later, sort of changed viewpoint on some of these things.
Yes, for sure. And we know oral history interviews are problematic. People's memories are subjective. We omit, we emphasize, we simply forget. And at this time, many individuals in the gay rights movement going back to the early 70s are thinking about their legacy. And they're sitting down with me and one of my students. They know that the transcript of the interview will be deposited at LaGuardia and Wagner Archives for future researchers. So I could see that some of them were a bit calculated, not deceptive, but calculated in how they remembered and maybe amplified their role. And some were quite territorial. Some were quite territorial about how things have been mythologized. And I'll mention Alan Roscoff. It's at the 1972 Inner Circle dinner. You know what the narrative was? That Morty Manford was badly beaten. And Alan maintains that Morty, he might have been shoved around a little bit, but he wasn't hospitalized. But the narrative became Morty was badly beaten, nearly lost his eye, was hospitalized. His mother, understandably so, Jean Manford, said, enough is enough. We need to start a parent support organization. We're going to start PFLAG. So this is what the narrative became, that Morty put his body on the line for the gay rights movement. And there was no greater form of commitment than putting your body on the line. It's one thing to protest, to engage in a ZAP, to write to your city council, to lobby, but to put your body on the line. Remember the civil rights movement, the Freedom Riders in 1961, desegregating bus terminals, getting badly beaten, pummeled, and they almost become Christ-like figures. So it's not a trivial matter, did he get beaten up or not, because he becomes like, it takes on greater significance. So people are contesting the history. People are contesting the history about Koch, portraying him in different ways, remembering him in different ways. John LaCicero, go listen to his interview. He said, I said, John, Koch could have leaned more on these city council members, could could have pressured them more, could have persuaded them more. He said, don't you think we tried that? We tried it all the time. We brought them into our office. People are prejudiced. Look at today, people are prejudiced. You're telling me that we should have done more? Of course we did as much as we could. How could you change people's mindset? So, yeah, the way people remember from a 2024 perspective and how they want to be thought about, perhaps remembered, how they want to correct the historical record, it's all really fascinating. Again, another reason to explore this exhibit.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I've definitely become conscious of over the years is how these mythologies are formed. And sometimes they're formed by the people at the time who have a very sort of specific agenda, and sometimes the public forms these mythologies because it's a great way to tell the story of how, you know, some terrible injustice was responded to, or how some great leap forward was, you know, because of these incredible sacrifices that people made. So, you know, there's I think a variety of ways in which those things can happen. You mentioned Koch, and he's obviously is a figure very important to this neighborhood. I wanted to delve a little bit more into that. So, you know, my political coming of age in New York was starting around 1990 when I came back to the city from college, and that was the sort of post-Koch split era, which was when all of those groups, whether they were Greenwich Village groups or Manhattan Democratic, gay groups, other groups, they'd all split in half between the ones who were still with Koch and the ones who were against Koch. So it really was this cleavage that that was defining for a good decade or more. You know, there was gay and lesbian independent Democrats versus Stonewall Democrats. It was village independent Democrats versus the Village Reform Democratic Club. You know, everybody was on one side of the Koch split. And you definitely hit on this somewhat, but I'd love to hear even more about where people were on Koch and how they sort of defined their sense of what was the right thing to do at the time in relation to what he did or didn't do.
Yes, activists won't forgive him, in particular on AIDS, for dragging his feet, for treading lightly on the quote-unquote gay issue. And people like Kramer, Roscoff, Andy Hum hold him accountable and are very scathing in their critique of Koch, especially with respect to providing services to people with AIDS. And they maintain that because he was in the closet, that he couldn't push hard on that, and they make comparisons to other cities like San Francisco, for example. You often hear that comparison, the difference, the distinctions. By Koch's third term, increasingly unpopular, many scandals in his administration, many individuals emerging in the area. Deborah Glick, for example, was very critical of Koch and has been in the state legislature since 30+ years. And of course, he's going to lose the election. He's running for re-election in 1989, loses to David Dinkins. And he's quite graceful in his concession speech at the time. But I think by that point, people had seen many liberal Democrats in Manhattan in particular, in lower Manhattan, were increasingly tired, fed up with Koch and, you know, using racially coded terms with respect to violence occurring in the city against the backdrop of the crack cocaine epidemic, and catering too much to this white ethnic base in the outer boroughs. So we do see this real split among Democrats circa 1989 and 90. And Koch, of course, you know, in the wake of the fiscal crisis when he took office in 78, had to deal with a city that was nearly bankrupt, and so it cuts the public sector and provides incentives to the private sector, organizations like the Central Park Conservancy, to fill in the role of the Parks Department, just to name one example. other local community, and just incentives to bring business back to the city, corporations back to the city which had left in the 60s and 70s. So to restore the city's finances. What historians call this neoliberal turn by the late 1970s, beginning to gut the public sector or trim the public sector and support private sector initiatives, the expansion of real estate and corporations in New York City. So many further on the left, in Manhattan in particular, increasingly critical of him, and he loses to Dinkins, as we say, in 1989.
And certainly doesn't entirely disappear, although he's made it clear, he makes it clear at that point he's done with elective office, but he certainly keeps his finger in the pot in a variety of ways. I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions, because I have no doubt that they have some. So why don't we turn it over? The first hand I saw was right over there.
Yeah. Forgive me for this question, and I'll just preface it by saying, you know, among the things I've done in my life, I got a regulation, chancellor's regulation passed, and the city council law passed. And when I look back, I realized that probably neither of them did any good, because there was nobody to actually implement them. And I'm wondering if you did any research into the impact of the gay rights bill once it was passed.
Yeah, we asked that question in most interviews. The bill is ultimately passed in 1986. City Council then passed an amendment to weaken the bill with respect to housing, that buildings with 4 units or less were exempt, would be exempt from this new bill. And after a campaign led by individuals like Bayard Rustin, prominent civil rights activist who was also gay, and many others, Koch vetoed that. So I want to make that point one. And of course, discrimination persisted after the bill.
But enforcement, were you able to do any
Yeah,
research?
there was, people were cognizant now that there's a bill on the books, you might get sued. If you're an employer, if you rent, if you evict somebody and you can...
So there was a private right of action, or was there an action? I mean, you know, or was it the Human Rights Commission or whatever that enforced it? But
Yeah.
That's my question, the actual enforcement mechanism and whether you could track any concrete impact.
Yeah, there were lawyers working for the Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Rights who would take cases. And it was added to the human rights law. The New York City Human Rights Commission added sexual orientation. So there was some enforcement, but many people who were largely disfranchised, poor people of color, I would argue, who did not have the resources to bring a case to court, you know, there's still going to be the persistence of discrimination. But it is a major step, it is a relief, it is a turning point. So it's a mixed bag, I would say.
Oh, I'm not denying the symbolic impact.
Okay, I have a comment, if I can.
Just one quick point, I just want to mention that you talked about the Human Rights Commission, which was charged with enforcing this. I know one of the people who you mentioned many times who's involved in this, Andy Humm. He was a member of the Human Rights Commission. So, you know, I think as with any law, there's always going to be a tension around enforcement.
Okay,
Yes?
in 1986, shortly after that was passed, one of my coworkers where I work tried to advance themselves by trying to get me fired for being gay. And my employer knew that it was illegal then. So it did have an impact because employers knew that they couldn't do that any longer. So I lived it, you know.
You fear a lawsuit, you fear repercussions. Yeah, so absolutely. But again, a law is passed doesn't mean people's attitudes change overnight.
or that enforcement is perfect, absolutely.
Not
Yes?
a question, but just an observation. I also thought it was really ironic that Larry Kramer and Ed Koch lived in the same building. And of course, I heard stories that Koch liked Larry's dog, and when I was going to pet him, and Larry would say, "Stay away from that man, he's killing daddy's friends." And I think he would do that too. So
I did, yes.
it wasn't quite a...
And Edie Windsor too.
Yes.
Edie Windsor, Larry Kramer, absolutely, and Ed Koch.
Lower Fifth Avenue.
Quite a building. Yes?
I have a question. What were some of the really defining things that helped move the bill forward from 1971 to 1985? Now, you mentioned some political figures and some ins and outs, but, I mean, were there events that, I mean, all the thing with the AIDS protests and ACT-UP and so on occurred after it got passed. So were there events that, or people that made it much more likely that the council then would vote in 1985? No.
Yes, even going back to the 70s, but these are incremental steps. 1973, when Jim Howells challenged Carol Reiser for city council in this district. 1977, when Anita Bryant, as I mentioned, launched her anti-gay rights campaign in Miami-Dade County, that mobilized gay and lesbian activists nationwide. So they really hunkered down and formed a coalition for gay, the CLG, or the Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Rights. So there was organizational activity, the formation of organizations throughout all 5 boroughs. I would also point out the 1985 David Rothenberg challenge to Carol Reiser. It becomes more prominent gay rights thanks to Rothenberg, an openly gay candidate, narrowly defeated, but he was able to raise money, gain key endorsements from major media organizations and other individual figures in New York. But really the turning point was 1985 election when Tom Cute retired. He was succeeded by Stephen DiBrienza in Brooklyn, Windsor Terrace Park Slope. A whole new crop of city council members, younger, more progressive.
And Stephen supported the gay rights bill.
And Stephen did support the gay rights bill, DiBrienza. He had run against Cute, lost in '82, and then won in '85 after Cute retired. So I think this is a real turning point, the 1985 elections and the elevation of Peter Malone to the position of
So
Speaker.
there were people in 1971, for example, that would have passed the bill, but it
If New York City were just Manhattan, the bill would have passed in 1974. The bill was defeated, it got a full floor vote in City Council, lost 22 to 19. And again, Manhattan was more progressive than the outer boroughs. So it's interesting that the political and geographical tapestry of New York and how council members were more progressive in certain areas and certain
Some
issues.
people in Queens got more interested, or they got elected?
They got elected, a new crop got elected by 1985, and again, it was still pretty close, 21 to 14. As late as 1986 when the bill finally passed. Malone himself voted against it, but at least he let the bill get out of the General Welfare Committee for a full floor vote.
Here's an interesting data point. You said New York was the 51st city to pass this. It was actually passed here. The first statewide gay rights law was passed in 1982 in Wisconsin. So New York City was 4 years behind Wisconsin. So the progress was slow here. But all the more reason why it's worth understanding how it went and why. Yes?
2 things. One, you can't find this anywhere on the internet, but a House of the New York Legislature passed a gay rights bill in 1985. It was a housing bill. In fact, a Republican conservative right to life candidate from member of the Assembly from Suffolk County voted for the bill. I lobbied him in that effort anyway. Also, not to wish good on people's demise, but I thought it was poetic justice in August of 1987 when I opened the New York Times and saw both Tom Cute and Aileen Ryan's obituary in the same day. They died less than 24 hours apart.
August 9th, 1987. Aileen Ryan and Tom Cute, both two leading opponents of the gay rights bill, died on the same day in 1987.
Yes.
Yes, hi. I can add a little bit to this story from my own experience of this legislative process. My name is Martha Hurst, and I, for years, 82 to 87, represented the Koch administration at the City Council. And with respect to Intro 2, and first of all, John Cicero is right in his assertion that years and years of very heavy conversations with people occurred in Ed Koch's office. And I would go out to community meetings and people would say, can't you just offer this opponent, a housing project or funding for something that he wants in his district? And I would need to say the truth, which was the bigotry there is way stronger than any housing project. And people were not going to vote for the bill at that time. You have very well described the dynamic, and it really was about Tom Cute's retirement and Peter Malone being elected speaker and the orchestration of that. And then the passage of that bill really became legislative process and politics, very similar to hundreds of other bills that I ever lobbied. And one of the things that occurred is that two very wonderful men, Tom Stoddard was one, he's no longer alive, Ethan Ghetto was the other, and I sat in my office at the Tweed Courthouse, 52 Chambers Street, crafting the language of Intro 2. And we did it in part because, anticipating a vote, we wanted the language to be such that, for want of a better description, you give people political cover to vote for the bill. So if you read the introduction to the bill and compare it to Intro 554 or anything way beforehand, you would see it spoke much more broadly about human rights in a more general way. The idea of modifying the bill was my idea because I've done this on all sorts of issues, cop issues and recycling issues and you name it. But the process, of course, was Tom Stoddard's effort at the drafting because he was a superb lawyer and draftsperson. And so we kept thinking about particular members of the council and the ways in which the language of the bill could help them and give them a narrative for the people in their districts. And I happened to live in Sal Albanise's district at that time, by the way. I also was, and was not a member of the community. And at the time working on that bill, I was 7 months pregnant, so I missed the vote on the most important civil rights issue I ever worked on because I had the baby. He's not 38. But Aileen Ryan there used to be something called the motion to discharge bills out of the committee. And those motions to discharge, to get to the full floor, always failed. And Aileen Ryan would chair those committee meetings orchestrated with the Speaker's office, the Majority Leader's office. And she had two sons, and they were very big guys, and they would stand like bodyguards at either end of the committee table to protect against what they feared, which was violence from decent people like, all of us involved in the issue. So it was the crafting of the language of Intro 2 that allowed for, because Mayor Koch did indeed say to Peter Malone, let people vote their conscience, but that didn't mean that people were not afraid to vote their consciences. So our goal was to draft language that at least in part allowed for some folks to have a narrative that was more aligned more generally with the notion this is the right thing to do for people. And the 21 votes were reflective of that. So thank you for the opportunity, but I have not been part of this effort and it's terrific to enrich them.
Martha, John Cicero mentioned, I actually tried to get in touch with you. I think John gave me your contact.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. And I appreciate that. And also your point, Martha, about political cover for council members who might have been on the fence. The city's Human Rights Commission in 1981 and in 1985 compiled a study, a survey, discrimination against gay and lesbian New Yorkers. And on these streets in Washington Square Park and Christopher Street had clipboards. Have you been discriminated against in housing, employment, public accommodations? And they collected this anecdotal data, compiled a report, submitted it to City Council in 81, about 35 individuals. Much more substantive in 1985, about 500 people interviewed, overwhelmingly spoke about individual cases of discrimination in these 3 areas. And this also helped provide cover for city council members, because some people are saying discrimination, what discrimination? You live in affluence in the West Village, that's not discrimination. And so, but these were important reports compiled by Human Rights Commission, and thank you for your other comments as well, about being cognizant of city council members and the pressures they felt to support the bill. This is a real turning point. This is a real turning point, the 1985 events that you mentioned. So thank you.
Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about the schisms within the Jewish community that people like Noah here?
Yeah, dear council member from Brooklyn vehemently opposed the bill. Meanwhile, secular Jews, Reform Jews, overwhelmingly in support of the bill. The CBST, the gay synagogue in Lower Manhattan, a pivotal institution, but liberal Jews overwhelmingly in support. But there is a schism. And it also reminds me of your comment about deer and your comments, Martha. One thing folks should go and see is the documentary film by Phil Zwickler, came out in 1987, called Rights and Reactions. We did a panel on this in June in Midtown. It's about a 58-minute film, and it's mostly this public hearing on the eve of the vote in March '86. Do you remember that? This public hearing at City Council, Andrew, was about 12 hours long. We've got the transcript in the archives, where people have 2 minutes to speak in City Council, and the vitriol that you hear, openly homophobic comments on the floor of City Council about why this bill should not be passed, or on the other hand, passionate testimony why it should be passed. And you see Noah Deer, for example, he's prominently featured. So if you haven't seen this, called Rights and Reactions by Phil Zwickler, Zwickler, a 58-minute documentary on it. It really illuminates this opposition. And many Orthodox Jews, too, turning their backs on City Council when the bill was finally passed 21-14 in the spring of '86. So indeed, schisms in this community.
I'm going to ask Jay.
Just one quick question. Prior to the passage, was there even a mayoral directive that protected city workers from discrimination?
Yeah, Koch passed that after he took office in '78, elected '77 to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation for city workers. So there was optimism. This is 1978, it'd take 8 more years to pass the bill.
Because one of the reasons I'm asking, I had occasion, I think 3 weeks ago, Mark Siegel, who founded the gay Philadelphia newspaper, who was a teenager at Stonewall, was the founder of GLF. He gave a talk in Harrisburg a few weeks ago. And when he moved back to Philly around 71 or so, he wrote to Milton Schaub, who was the governor of Pennsylvania. This is a totally unknown chapter. They currently have a small exhibit up, and he spoke about Milton Schaub being the first equality governor because he took a meeting with his teenager, and then he passed the first anti-discrimination measure in the world for state government in Philadelphia, and it branched out to all the state agencies. So that was around 72, I believe. So New York on everything was really late.
Yeah, it makes you rethink New York as a queer-friendly city.
Yeah.
New York isn't just Greenwich Village. So, yeah, thank you.
One last question, which you didn't hit on, but what I know it's in there though, and it's a prominent part of what was the battle, the police union and the fire department. Can you just sort of briefly mention the role that they played in all of this, which is shocking to 2024 ears and eyes, but if you're old enough to remember, it makes sadly perfect sense.
Yeah, both the NYPD and the New York Fire Department overwhelmingly opposed to the gay rights bill. And when the bill was about to get a full floor vote in '74, lobbied intensely against it. using arguments that people in the military would use in the 90s during the Clinton era. Well, having a gay fireman sleep in the firehouse would be problematic, would undermine morale. Having a gay officer would undermine morale. It turns out there, of course, were many gay cops and many gay firemen. And one of the most moving pieces of testimony, you were asking about pivotal moments, was Charlie
Cochran.
Charlie Cochran, it's in here. Charlie Cochran, David Rothenberg talks about it, and Ruth Messenger talked about it. Check it out, Advocacy in the Gay Rights Bill in City Council. They talk about Charlie Cochran's testimony in City Council in 1981. Rothenberg is especially articulated his theater background. He helped coach Cochran about something like, I am Charlie Cochran, I am a cop, I represent this precinct, and I'm also gay. And the City Council just erupted into cheers like you would not believe by gay activists applauding this man for his courage and bravery to come out as a gay cop and testify in 1981. And there was indeed a gay organization. The GOAL is the acronym, was Gay Officers Action League, GOAL. So within all of these institutions overwhelmingly opposed to the gay rights bill, there are always dissidents. That's why I don't want to make blanket statements about the Catholic Church because there's dignity, about the police department because there's GOAL. But you're right, overwhelmingly opposed to it, and again, powerful institutions in New York politics.
I think Charlie Cochran wasn't only a cop, he was a sergeant when he did
Correct. Correct.
So we have a street corner named for just
wow.
3 blocks down 6th Avenue, because Gold met at St. Joseph's Church. So the battery on my microphone is dead, so I'm going to wrap it up here.
I just want to say one thing, that I think it should be mentioned that this election day, there's a ballot on Proposition 1 that will solidify gay rights and all rights, non-discrimination, into the Constitution.
It's a statewide ballot.
Yeah, and we have to vote yes on it. A lot of people don't know that.
Thank you very much.